New York City, March 18th, 2014. 6. The bell chimes and Bea strides in. "Robbie wants to know if you're avoiding him," she says, in lieu of hello. Henry's heart sinks. The answer is yes, of course, and no. He cannot shake the look of hurt in Robbie's eyes, but it doesn't excuse the way he acted. Or maybe it does. "I'll take that as a yes," says Bea. "And where have you been hiding?" Henry wants to say, "I saw you at the dinner party," but wonders if she has forgotten the entire night or just the parts that Addie touched. Speaking of, "Bea, this is Addie." Beatrice turns toward her, and for a second, and only a second, Henry thinks that she remembers. It's the way she's looking at Addie, as if she is a piece of art, but one that Bea has encountered before. Despite everything, Henry expects her to nod, to say, "Oh, good to see you again." Instead, Bea smiles. She says, "You know, there's something timeless about your face." And he's rocked by the strangeness of the echo, the force of the déjà vu. But Addie only smiles and says, "I've heard that before." As Bea continues to study Addie, Henry studies her. She has always been ruthlessly polished, but today there's neon paint on her fingers, a kiss of gold at her temple, what looks like powdered sugar on her sleeve. "What have you been doing?" he asks. She looks down. "Oh, I was at the artifact," she says, as if that's supposed to mean something. Seeing his confusion, she explains. The artifact is, according to Beatrice, part carnival and part art exhibit, an interactive medley of installations on the High Line. As Bea talks about mirrored chambers and glass domes full of stars, sugar clouds, the plume from pillow fights, and murals made of 1,000 strangers' notes, Addie brightens, and Henry thinks it must be hard to surprise a girl who's lived 300 years. So when she turns to him, eyes bright, and says, "We have to go," there's nothing he'd rather do. There is, of course, the matter of the store, the fact he is the sole employee, and there are still 4 hours until closing. But he has an idea. Henry grabs a bookmark, the store's only piece of merchandise, and begins writing on the backside. "Hey, Bea," he says, pushing the makeshift card across the counter. "Can you close up?" "I have a life," she says, but then she looks down at Henry's tight and slanting script. The Library of the Last Word. Bea smiles and pockets the card. "Have fun," she says, waving them out. New York City, September 5th, 2013. 7. Sometimes Henry wishes he had a cat. He supposes he could just adopt Book, but the tabby feels indivisible from the last word, and he can't shake the superstitious belief that if he tried to extricate the ancient cat from the second-hand shop, it would turn to dust before he got it home. Which is, he knows, a morbid way of thinking about people and places, or in this case, pets and places, but it's dusk, and he drank a little too much whiskey, and Bea had to go teach a class, and Robbie had a friend's show, so he's alone again, heading back to an empty apartment, wishing he had a cat or something waiting for him to come home. He tests out the phrase as he walks in. "Hi, kitty, I'm home," he says, before realizing that it makes him a 28-year-old bachelor talking to an imaginary pet, and that feels infinitely worse. He grabs a beer from the fridge, stares down at the bottle opener, and realizes it belongs to Tabitha. A pink and green thing in the shape of a lucha libre from a trip she took to Mexico City last month. He tosses it aside, opens a kitchen drawer looking for another, and finds a wooden spoon, a dance company magnet, a handful of ridiculous bendy straws, looks around, then sees a dozen more things strewn around the apartment, all of them hers. He digs up a box of books and turns them out, begins filling it again with photographs, note cards, paperbacks, a pair of ballet flats, a mug, a bracelet, a hairbrush, a photograph. He finishes the first beer, opens a second on the edge of the counter, and keeps going, moving from room to room, less a methodic procession than a lost wander. An hour later, the box is only half full, but Henry's losing steam. He doesn't want to do this anymore, doesn't even want to be here in an apartment that somehow feels both empty and cluttered. There's too much space to think. There's not enough to breathe. Henry sits between the empty beer bottles and the half-filled box for several minutes, knee bouncing, and then surges to his feet and goes out. The Merchant is busy. It always is, one of those neighborhood bars whose success owes more to its sheer proximity than to the quality of its drinks. A local institution. Most of the people who frequent the Merchant refer to it simply as the bar. Henry weaves through the crowd, grabs a stool at the edge of the counter, hoping the ambient noise of the place will make him feel a little less alone. Mark's on shift tonight, a 50-something with gray sideburns and a catalog smile. It normally takes a good 10 minutes to flag him down, but tonight the bartender comes straight to him, ignoring the cue. Henry orders tequila, and Mark comes back with a bottle and a pair of shots. "On the house," he says, pouring himself a matching glass. Henry manages a wan smile. "Do I look that rough?" But there's no pity in Mark's gaze, only a strange and subtle light. "You look great," he says, just like Muriel, and it's the first time he's said more than a single line, his answers usually limited to drink orders and nods. Their glasses knock together, and Henry orders a second, and a third. He knows he is drinking too much too fast, piling liquor on top of the beers from home, the whiskey he'd poured at work. A girl comes up to the bar and glances at Henry. She looks away, and then back again, as if seeing him for the first time. And there it is again, that shine, a film of light over her eyes as she leans in, and he can't seem to catch her name, but it doesn't matter. They do their best to talk over the noise, her hand resting at first on his forearm, then his shoulder, before sliding through his hair. "Come home with me," she says, and he's so caught by the longing in her voice, the open want. But then her friends come along and peel her away, their own eyes shining as they say sorry, say, "You're such a good guy," say, "Have a great night." Henry slides off the stool and heads for the bathroom, and this time he can feel the ripple, the heads turning toward him. A guy catches his arm and says something about a photography project, how he'd be a perfect fit, before sliding him his card. Two women try to draw him into the circle of their conversation. "I wish I had a son like you," says one. "Son?" says the other with a raucous laugh as he twists free, escapes down the hall and into the toilets, braces himself against the counter. He has no idea what's happening. He thinks back to the coffee shop that morning, Vanessa's number on the bottom of the cup, to the customers in the store, all so eager for his help, to Muriel, who told him he looked well, to the pale fog like candle smoke in all of their eyes. He looks down at the watch on his wrist, glinting in the bathroom light, and for the first time, he's certain that it's real. That the man in the rain was real. The deal was real. "Hey." He looks up and sees a guy, glassy-eyed and smiling at Henry like they are the best of friends. "You look like you could use a bump." He holds out a little glass jar, and Henry stares at the tiny column of powder inside. He was 12 the first time he got high. Someone handed him a joint behind the bleachers, and the smoke burned his lungs, and he almost threw up. But then everything went a little soft. Weed made space in his skull, eased the nervous terror in his heart. But he couldn't control the places it took his head. Valium and Xanax were better, dulling everything at once. But he's always stayed away from the harder stuff, out of fear, not the fear that something would go wrong, just the opposite. The fear it would feel right. The fear of the slip, the slide of knowing he wouldn't be strong enough to stop. It's never been the high he craved anyway, not exactly. It's just the quiet, that happy side effect. He tried to be better for Tabitha, but Tabitha's gone, and it doesn't matter anyway. Not anymore. Now, Henry just wants to feel good. He taps the powder onto his thumb, has no idea if he's doing it right, but he inhales, and it hits like a sudden, jolting cold, and then the world opens. The details clear, the colors brighten, and somehow everything gets sharp and fuzzy at the same time. Henry must have said something, because the guy laughs, and then he reaches out and wipes a fleck from Henry's cheek, and the contact is like static shock, a spark of energy where skin meets skin. "You're perfect," says the stranger, fingers drifting down his jaw, and Henry flushes with a dizzy heat that makes him need to move. "Sorry," he says, backing out into the hall. He slumps against the darkened wall, waits for the world to steady. "Hey." He looks up and sees a guy with his arms slung around a girl's shoulders, both of them long and lean and feline. "What's your name?" asks the guy. "Henry." "Henry," echoes the girl with a cat-like smile. She looks at him with such obvious desire, he actually rocks back on his heels. No one has ever looked at him that way. Not Tabitha, not Robbie, no one. Not on the first date, or in the middle of sex, or when he got down on one knee. "I'm Lucia," she says. "This is Benji, and we've been looking for you." "What did I do?" he asks. Her smile tilts. "Nothing yet." She bites her lip, and the guy looks at Henry, his face slack with longing, and at first he doesn't realize what they're talking about. And then he does. Laughter rolls through him, a strange, unbridled thing. He's never been in a threesome, unless you count that one time in school when he and Robbie and one of their friends got incredibly drunk, and he's still not entirely sure how far things went. "Come with us," she says, holding out her hand. And a dozen excuses spill through his mind, and then out again, as Henry follows them home. New York City, September 7th, 2013. 8. God, it feels good to be wanted. Everywhere he goes, he can feel the ripple, the attention shifting toward him. Henry leans into the attention, the smiles, the warmth, the light. For the first time, he truly understands the concept of being drunk with power. It's like setting down a heavy weight long after your arms have gotten tired. There's this sudden, sweeping lightness, like air in your chest, like sunlight after rain. It feels good to be the user instead of the used, to be the one who gets instead of the one who loses. It feels good. It shouldn't, he knows, but it does. He stands in line at the roast, desperately needing coffee. The last few days have been a blur, late nights giving way to strange mornings, every moment fueled by the heady pleasure of being wanted, of knowing that whatever they see, it's good, it's great, it's perfect. He's perfect. And it's not just the straightforward gravity of lust, not always. People drift toward him now, every one of them pulled into his orbit, but the why is always different. Sometimes it's just simple desire, but other times it's more nuanced. Sometimes it's an obvious need, and other times he can't guess what they see when they look at him. That's the only unsettling part, really. Their eyes. The fog that winds through them, thickening to frost, to ice. A constant reminder that this new life isn't exactly normal, isn't entirely real. But it's enough. Next! He steps forward and looks up and sees Vanessa. "Oh, hi," he says. You didn't call. But she doesn't sound angry or annoyed. If anything, she sounds too bright, teasing. But it's the kind of teasing used to cover up embarrassment. He should know. He's used that tone a dozen times to hide his own hurt. I'm sorry, he says, blushing. I wasn't sure if I should. Vanessa smiles slyly. Was the whole name and number thing too subtle? Henry laughs and hands his cell across the counter. Call me, he says, and she taps her number in and hits call. There, says Henry, taking back the phone. Now I have no excuse. He feels like an idiot even as he says it, like a kid reciting movie lines, but Vanessa only blushes and bites her bottom lip, and he wonders what would happen if he told her to go out with him right then, if she would take off her apron and duck beneath the counter, but he doesn't try it, just says, I'll call. And she says, You better. Henry smiles, turns to go. He's almost to the door when he hears his name. Mr. Strauss. Henry's stomach drops. He knows the voice, can picture the older man's tweed jacket, his salt and pepper hair, the look of disappointment on his face as he advised Henry to step away from the department, the school, and try to figure out where his passion was, because it clearly wasn't there. Henry tries to muster a smile, feels himself falling short. Dean Melrose, he says, turning to face the man who pushed him off the road. And there he is, flesh and bone and tweed. But instead of the contempt Henry got so used to seeing, the dean looks pleased. A smile splits his trim gray beard. What a lucky turn, he says. You're just the man I wanted to see. Henry has a hard time believing that, until he notices the pale smoke twisting through the man's eyes. And he knows he should be polite, but what he wants to do is tell the dean to go fuck himself, so he splits the difference and simply asks, Why? There's a position opening in the theology school, and I think you'd be perfect for it. Henry almost laughs. You've got to be kidding. Not at all. I never finished my PhD. You failed me. The dean holds up a finger. I didn't fail you. Henry bristles. You threatened to if I didn't leave. I know, he says, looking genuinely sorry. I was wrong. 3 words he's sure this man has never used. Henry wants to savor them, but he can't. No, he says. You were right. It wasn't a good fit. I wasn't happy there, and I have no desire to go back. It's a lie. He misses the structure, misses the path, misses the purpose, and maybe it wasn't a perfect fit, but nothing is. Come in for an interview, says Dean Melrose, holding out his card. Let me change your mind. You're late. Bee's waiting on the bookstore steps. Sorry, he says, unlocking the door. Still not a library, he adds as she slaps a $5 bill on the counter and disappears into the art section. She makes a non-committal and he can hear her pulling books from the shelves. B is the only one who hasn't changed, the only one who doesn't seem to treat him differently. Hey, he says, following her down the aisle. Do I look strange to you? No, she says, scanning the shelves. B, look at me. She turns, gives him a long up and down appraisal. You mean besides the lipstick on your neck? Henry blushes, wiping at his skin. Yeah, he says, besides that. She shrugs. Not really. But it's there, in her eyes, that unmistakable shimmer, a faint and iridescent film that seems to spread as she studies him. Really? Nothing? She pulls a book from the shelf. Henry, what do you want me to say? She asks, searching for a second. You look like you. So you don't... He doesn't know how to ask. You don't want me, then. B turns and looks at him for a long moment and then bursts out laughing. Sorry, hon, she says when she catches her breath. Don't get me wrong, you're cute, but I'm still a lesbian. And the moment she says it, he feels absurd, and absurdly relieved. What's this about? She asks. I made a deal with the devil, and now whenever anyone looks at me, they see only what they want. He shakes his head. Nothing. Never mind. Well, she says, adding another book to her stack, I think I found a new thesis. She carries the books back up to the counter and spreads them out on top of the ledgers and receipts. Henry watches her turn through the pages until she finds what she's looking for in each, then steps back so he can see what she's found. 3 portraits, all of them renditions of a young woman, though they clearly come from different times and different schools. What am I looking at? He asks. I call her the ghost in the frame. One is a pencil sketch, the edges rough, unfinished. In it, the woman lies on her stomach, tangled in sheets. Hair pools around her, and her face is little more than panes of a shadow, a faint scattering of freckles across her cheeks. The title of the piece is written in Italian. Ho portato la stella a letto. The English translation sits beneath. I took the stars to bed. The second piece is French, a more abstract portrait, done in the vivid blues and greens of Impressionism. The woman sits on a beach, a book face down on the sand beside her. She looks over her shoulder at the artist, only the edge of her face visible, her freckles little more than smudges of light, absences of color. La Sirène, this one is called. The Siren. The last piece is a shallow carving, a silhouette sculpture shot through with light, pinpoint tunnels burrowed through a pane of cherry wood. Constellation. Do you see it? Asks B. They're portraits. No, she says. They're portraits of the same woman. Henry lifts a brow. That's a stretch. Look at the angle of her jaw, the line of her nose, and the freckles. Count them. Henry does. In every image, there are exactly 7. B touches the first and second. The Italian one's from the turn of the 19th century. The French one is 50 years later, and this one, she says, tapping the photo of the sculpture, this one's from the 60s. So maybe one was inspired by the other, says Henry. Wasn't there a tradition of, I forget what it was called, but basically visual telephone? One artist favored something, and then another artist favored that artist, and so on, like a template. But B is already waving him away. Sure, in lexicons and bestiaries, but not in formal schools of art. This is like putting a girl with a pearl earring in a Warhol and a Degas without ever seeing the Rembrandt. And even if she became a template, the fact is this template influenced centuries of art. She's a piece of connective tissue between eras. So, echoes Henry. So who was she? B's eyes are bright, the way Robbie's sometimes are when he's just nailed a performance or done a bump of coke, and Henry doesn't want to bring her down, but she's clearly waiting for him to say something. Okay, he starts, gently. But, B, what if she was no one? Even if these are based on the same woman, what if the first artist simply made her up? B frowns, already shaking her head. Look, he says, no one wants you to find your thesis topic more than I do, for the sake of this store as much as your sanity. And this all sounds cool, but didn't your last proposal get nixed for being too whimsical? Esoteric. Right, says Henry. And if a topic like postmodernism and its effects on New York architecture was too esoteric, how do you think Dean Parrish will feel about this? He gestures to the open texts, the freckled faces staring up from every page. B looks at him in silence for a long moment, and then at the books. Fuck! She shouts, taking up one of the giant books and storming out of the shop. Henry watches her go and sighs. Not a library, he calls after her, returning the rest to their shelves. New York City, March 18th, 2014. 9. Henry trails off as the realization dawns. He'd forgotten about B's attempt at finding a new thesis, one quiet detail mixed into a very loud season, but now it's obvious. The girl in the sketch, the painting, the sculpture, is leaning on the rail beside him, her face open in delight. They are walking through Chelsea on the way to the High Line, and he stops halfway through a crosswalk, realizing the obvious truth, the gleam of light like a tear in his story. "It was you," he says. Addie flashes a dazzling smile. "It was." A car honks, the flashing sign gone solid in warning, and they run to the other side. "It's funny, though," she says as they climb the iron steps. "I didn't know about the second one. I remember sitting on that beach, remember the man with his easel up on the pier, but I never found the finished piece." Henry shakes his head. "I thought you couldn't leave a mark." "I can't," she says, looking up. "I can't hold a pen. I can't tell a story. I can't wield a weapon or make someone remember. But art," she says with a quieter smile, "art is about ideas, and ideas are wilder than memories. They're like weeds always finding their way up." "But no photographs, no film." Her expression falters, just a fraction. "No," she says, the word a shape on her lips. And he feels bad for asking, for drawing her back to the bars of her curse instead of the gaps she's found between them. But then Addie straightens, lifts her chin, smiles with an almost defiant kind of joy. "But isn't it wonderful," she says, "to be an idea?" They reach the High Line just as a gust of wind blows through, the air still edged with winter, but instead of folding in against him, sheltering from the breeze, Addie leans into the wild gust, cheeks blushing with the cold, hair whipping around her face, and in that moment he can see what every artist saw, what drew them to their pencils and their paint, this impossible, uncatchable girl. And even though he's safe, both feet firmly on the ground, Henry feels himself begin to fall. New York City, September 13th, 2013. 10. People talk a lot about home. Home is where the heart is, they say. There's no place like home. Too long away and you get homesick. Homesick. Henry knows that one is supposed to mean sick for home, not from it, but it still feels right. He loves his family, he does. He just doesn't always like them, doesn't like who he is around them. And yet, here he is, driving 90 minutes north, the city sinking behind him as a rented car hums under his hands. Henry knows he could take the train, it's certainly cheaper, but the truth is he likes driving. Or rather, he likes the white noise that comes with driving, the steady concreteness of going from here to there, the directions, the control. Most of all, he likes the inability to do anything else but drive, hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, music blaring through the speakers. He offered to give Muriel a ride, was secretly relieved when she said she was taking the train already, that David had gotten in that morning and would pick her up from the station, which means Henry will be the last one there. Henry is always somehow the last one there. The closer he gets to Newburgh, the more the weather changes in his head, a warning rumble on the surface, a storm rolling in. He takes a deep breath, bracing himself for a Strauss family dinner. He can picture it, the five of them sitting around the linen-covered table like an awkward Ashkenazi imitation of a Rockwell painting, a stiff tableau, his mother on one end, his father on the other, his siblings seated side by side across the table. David, the pillar, with his stern eyes and stiff posture. Muriel, the tornado, with her wild dark curls and constant energy. And Henry, the ghost. Even his name doesn't fit. Not Jewish at all, but a nod to one of his father's oldest friends. At least they look the part of a family. A quick survey of the table, and one can easily pick out the echo of a cheek, a jaw, a brow. David wears his glasses just like Dad, perched at the end of his nose so the top line of the frames cuts across his gaze. Muriel smiles like Mom, open and easy, laughs like her too, head thrown back, the sound bright and full. Henry has his father's loose black curls, his mother's gray-green eyes, but something has been lost in the arrangement. He lacks one's steadiness and the other's joy. The set of his shoulders, the line of his mouth, these subtle things that always make him seem more like a guest in someone else's house. This is how the dinner will pass. His father and brother talking medicine, his mother and sister talking art, and Henry dreading the moment when the questions turn toward him. When his mother worries aloud about everything, and his father finds an excuse to use the word unmoored, and David reminds him that he's almost 30, and Muriel advises him to commit, really commit, as if their parents aren't still paying her cell phone bills. Henry turns off the freeway and feels the wind pick up in his ears, passes through the center of town, and hears thunder in his skull, the static energy of tension. He knows he's late. He is always late. It has been the start of many quarrels, and there was a time when he thought it was carelessness on his part, before he realized it was some strange attempt at self-preservation, an intentional, albeit subconscious, dawdling, a delay of the inevitable, uncomfortable necessity of showing up, being seated at that table, boxed in by his siblings, positioned across from his parents like a criminal before a firing squad. So Henry is late, and when his father answers the door, he braces for the mention of timing, the chastising frown, the cutting remark on how his brother and sister always manage to arrive 5 minutes early. But his father only smiles. "There you are," he says, eyes bright and warm, and threaded with fog. Maybe this won't be like any other Strauss family dinner. "Look who's here," calls his father, leading Henry into the study. "Long time no see," says David, shaking his hand, because even though they live in the same city, hell, on the same subway line, the last time Henry saw his brother was here, on the first night of Hanukkah. "Henry!" A blur of dark curls, and then Muriel has thrown her arms around his neck. She kisses his cheek, leaving a smudge of coral lipstick he will later scrub off in the hall mirror. And nowhere between the study and the dining room does anyone comment on the length of his hair, which is always somehow too long, or the state of the sweater he's wearing, which is frayed, but also the most comfortable thing he owns. Not once does anyone tell him that he's too thin, or that he needs more sun, or that he looks tired, even though all of those usually precede the pointed remarks of how it can't be that hard to run a bookshop in Brooklyn. His mother comes out of the kitchen, tugging off a pair of oven mitts. She cups his face and smiles and tells him she's so happy he's there. Henry believes her. "To the family," toasts his father when they sit down to eat. "Together again." He feels like he's stepped into another version of his life, not ahead or behind, but sideways. One where his sister looks up to him, and his brother doesn't look down, where his parents are proud, and all the judgment has been sucked out of the air like smoke vented from a fire. He didn't realize how much connective tissue was made up of guilt. Without the weight of it, he feels dizzy and light. Euphoric. There is no mention of Tabitha or the failed proposal, though of course the knowledge of their breakup has circulated, the outcome made obvious by the empty chair no one even tries to play off as a household tradition. Last month on the phone, when Henry told David about the ring, his brother wondered, almost absently, if he thought she would actually agree. Muriel never liked her, but Muriel never liked any of Henry's partners. Not because they were all too good for him, though she would have said that too, but simply because she found them boring, an extension of the way she felt about Henry himself. Cable TV, that's what she sometimes called them. Better than watching paint dry, sure, but little more than reruns. The only one she even vaguely approved of was Robbie, and even then, Henry was sure it was mostly for the scandal it would cause if he ever brought him home. Only Muriel knows about Robbie, that he was ever more than a friend. It's the one secret that she's managed to keep. The whole dinner is so unnerving. David is warm, curious. Muriel is attentive and kind. His father listens to everything he says and seems genuinely interested. His mother tells him she's proud. Of what? He asks, genuinely confused, and she laughs as if it's a ridiculous question. Of you! The absence of judgment is jarring, a kind of existential vertigo. He tells them about running into Dean Melrose, waits for David to point out the obvious, that he's not qualified, waits for his father to ask him about the catch. His mother will go silent, while his sister will go loud, exclaiming that he changed directions for a reason, and demanding to know the point of it all if he just crawls back. But none of that happens. Good, says his father. They'd be lucky to have you, says his mother. You'd make a good teacher, says David. Only Muriel offers a shadow of dissent. You were never happy there. But there's no judgment in the words, only a fierce protectiveness. After dinner, everyone retreats to their respective corners, his mother to the kitchen, his father and brother to the study, his sister out into the night to look at stars and feel grounded, which is usually code for getting stoned. Henry goes into the kitchen to help his mother with the dishes. I'll wash you dry, she says, handing him a towel. They find a pleasant rhythm, and then his mother clears her throat. I'm sorry about Tabitha, she says, her voice low, as if she knows the subject is taboo. I'm sorry you wasted so much time on her. It wasn't a waste, he says, even though it does kind of feel that way. She rinses a plate. I just want you to be happy. You deserve to be happy. Her eyes shine, and he's not sure if it's the strange frost or simply maternal tears. You're strong, and smart, and successful. I don't know about that, Henry says, drawing a plate. I still feel like a disappointment. Don't talk like that, says his mother, looking genuinely hurt. She cups his cheek. I love you, Henry, just as you are. Her hand drops to the plate. Let me finish up, she says. Go find your sister. Henry knows exactly where she is. He steps out onto the back porch, sees Muriel sitting on the porch swing, smoking a joint and looking out at the trees, striking a pensive pose. She always sits like that, as if waiting for someone to snap a photo. He has, once or twice, but it always looked too stiff, too framed. Trust Muriel to make a candid look staged. The boards creak a little under his feet now, and she smiles without looking up. Hey, Hen. How did you know it was me? He asks, sinking down beside her. You have the lightest step, she says, passing him the joint. Henry takes a long drag, holds the smoke in his chest until he feels it in his head, a soft, buzzing blur. They pass the joint back and forth, studying their parents through the glass. Well, their parents and David, who trails behind their father, striking the exact same poses. So creepy, mutters Muriel. Uncanny, really. She chuckles. Why don't we hang out more? You're busy, he says, because it's kinder than reminding her they aren't really friends. She leans her head against his shoulder. I always have time for you. They smoke in silence until there's nothing left to smoke, and their mother calls out that it's time for dessert. Henry stands, his head swimming in a pleasant way. Mint, she asks, holding out a tin, but when he opens it, he sees the pile of little pink pills. Umbrellas. He thinks of the rain pelting down, the stranger beside him, perfectly dry, and snaps the tin shut. No thanks. They go back inside for dessert, spend the next hour talking about everything and nothing, and all of it is so nice, so aggressively pleasant, so mercifully free of snide remarks, petty squabbles, passive disapproval, that Henry feels like he's holding his breath, still holding on to the high, his lungs aching, but his heart happy. He rises, setting his coffee aside. I should get going. You could stay, offers his mom, and for the first time in 10 years, he's actually tempted, wonders what it would be like to wake up to this, the warmth, the ease, the feeling of family. But the truth is, the evening's been too perfect. He feels like he's walking that narrow line between a good buzz and a night on the bathroom floor, and he doesn't want anything to tip the balance. I have to get back, he says. The shop opens at 10. You work so hard, is a thing his mother has never said, a thing she apparently says now. David grips his shoulder and looks at him with those mercifully clouded eyes and says, I love you, Henry. I'm glad you're doing so well. Muriel wraps her arms around his waist. Don't be such a stranger. His father follows him out to the car, and when Henry holds out his hand, his father pulls him in for a hug and says, I'm proud of you, son. And part of him wants to ask why, to bait, to test the limits of this spell, to press his father into faltering, but he can't bring himself to do it. He knows it's not real, not in the strictest sense, but he doesn't care. It still feels good. New York City, March 18th, 2014. 11. Laughter spills down from the High Line. Built along a defunct rail, the raised park runs down the western edge of Manhattan from 30th to 12th. It's normally a pleasant place, with food carts and gardens, tunnels and benches, winding paths and city views. Today, it is something else entirely. The artifact has consumed a stretch of the elevated rail, transformed it into a dreamlike jungle gym of color and light, a three-dimensional landscape of whimsy and wonder. At the entrance, a volunteer gives them colored rubber bands to wear around their wrists, a rainbow against their skin, each one providing access to a different piece of the exhibit. This will get you into the sky, she says, as if the works of art are rides at an amusement park. This will get you into voice. This will get you into memory. She smiles at Henry as she talks, her eyes a milky blue. But as they move through the carnival of free exhibits, the artists all turn to look at Addie. He may be a sun, but she is a shining comet, dragging their focus like burning meteors in her wake. Nearby, a guy sculpts pieces of cotton candy as if they were balloons, then hands out the edible works of art. Some of them are recognizable shapes. Here is a dog, here is a giraffe, here is a dragon, while others are abstract. Here is a sunset, here is a dream, here is nostalgia. To Henry, they all taste like sugar. Addie kisses him, and she tastes like sugar too. The green band gets them into memory, which turns out to be a sort of three-dimensional kaleidoscope made of colored glass, a sculpture that rises to every side and turns with every step. They hold on to each other as the world bends and rights and bends again around them, and neither says it, but both, he thinks, are happy to get out. The art spills into the space between the exhibits, a field of metal sunflowers, a pool of melted crayons, a curtain of water as thin as paper that leaves nothing but mist on his glasses, an iridescent shine on Addie's skin. The sky, it turns out, lives inside a tunnel. Made by a light artist, it's a series of interlocking rooms. From the outside, they don't look like much, the wood frames, shells of bare construction, little more than nail and stud. But inside is everything. They move hand in hand so they won't lose each other. One space is glaringly bright, the next so dark the world seems to plunge away, and Addie shivers beside him, fingers tightening on Henry's arm. The next is pale with fog, like the inside of a cloud, and in the next, filaments as thin as rain rise and fall to every side. Henry runs his fingers through the field of drops, and they ring like chimes. The last room is filled with stars. It is a black chamber, identical to the one before it, only this time 1,000 pinprick lights break through the obscurity, carving a Milky Way close enough to touch, a majesty of constellations. And even in the almost dark, Henry can see Addie's upturned face, the edges of her smile. 300 years, she whispers, and you can still find something new. When they step out the other side, blinking in the afternoon light, she is already pulling him on, out of the sky and on to the next archway, the next set of doors, eager to discover whatever waits beyond. New York City, September 19th, 2013. 12. For once, Henry is early. Which he figures is better than being late, but he doesn't want to be too early because that's even worse, even weirder, and he needs to stop overthinking it. He smooths his shirt, checks his hair in the side of a parked car, and goes inside. The taqueria is bright and bustling, a concrete cavern of a place, with garage door windows and a food truck parked in the corner of the room, and it doesn't matter if he's early, because Vanessa is already inside. She's traded the barista apron for leggings and a print dress, and her blonde hair, which he's only seen pulled up, hangs in loose waves around her face, and when she sees him, she breaks into a smile. "I'm glad you called," she says, and Henry smiles back. "So am I." They order using slips of paper and those little pencils Henry hasn't seen since he played mini-golf one time when he was 10, fingers brushing as she points to tacos and he fills them in. Their hands touch again over the chips, legs skimming beneath the metal table, and each time it's like a tiny burst of light inside his chest. And for once, he isn't talking himself in and out of every single line, isn't chiding himself for each and every move, isn't convincing himself that he has to say the right thing. There's no need to find the right words when there are no wrong ones. He doesn't have to lie, doesn't have to try, doesn't have to be anyone but himself, because he is enough. The food is great, but the place is noisy, voices echoing off high ceilings, and Henry cringes when someone scrapes their chair back over the concrete floor. "Sorry," he says. "I know it's not fancy." He picked the place, knows they probably should have just gone for drinks, but it's New York, and cocktails cost twice as much as food, and he can barely afford even this on a bookseller's wages. "Dude," she says, stirring an agua fresca, "I work in a coffee shop." "At least you get tips." Vanessa feigns shock. "What, they don't tip booksellers?" "Nope." "Not even when you recommend a good book?" He shakes his head. "That's a crime," she says. "You should put a jar on the counter." "What would I say?" He raps his fingers on the table. "Books feed hungry minds. Tips feed the cat?" Vanessa laughs, sudden and bright. "You're so funny." "Am I?" She sticks out her tongue. "Fishing for compliments, are we?" "No," he says. "Just curious. What do you see in me?" Vanessa smiles, suddenly shy. Well, it sounds cheesy, but you're exactly what I've been looking for." "And what's that?" he asks. If she said real, sensitive, thoughtful, he might have bought it, but she doesn't. She uses words like outgoing, funny, ambitious, And the more she talks about him, the thicker the frost in her eyes, the more it spreads, until he can barely make out the color beneath. And Henry wonders how she can see, but of course, she can't. That's the point. They're at the Merchant a week later, he and Bea and Robbie, 3 beers and a basket of fries between them. "How's Vanessa?" she asks, while Robbie looks pointedly into his drink. "She's fine," says Henry. And she is. He is. They are. "Been seeing a lot of her." Henry frowns. "You're the one who told me to get Tabitha out of my system." Bea holds up her hands. I know. It's new. You know how things are. She's a carbon copy," mumbles Robbie. Henry turns on him. "What was that?" he asks, annoyed. "Speak up. I know they taught you how to project." Robbie takes a long swig of beer, looking miserable. "I'm just saying, she's a carbon copy of Tabby. Waifish, blonde, a female." It's a long-running sore point between them, the fact that Henry isn't gay, that he's attracted to a person first and their gender second. Robbie cringes, but doesn't apologize. "Besides," says Henry, "I didn't go after Vanessa. She picked me. She likes me." "Do you like her?" asks Bea. "Of course," he says, a little too fast. He likes her. And sure, he also likes that she likes him, the him that she sees, and there's a Venn diagram between those two, a place where they overlap. He's pretty sure he's safely in the shaded zone. He's not really using her, is he? At least he's not the only one being shallow. She's using him too, painting someone else onto the canvas of her life. And if it's mutual, well, then it's not his fault. Is it? "We just want you to be happy," Bea's saying. "After all that's happened, just don't go too fast." But for once, he's not the one who needs to slow down. Henry woke up that morning to chocolate chip pancakes and a glass of OJ, a little handwritten note on the counter beside the plate with a heart and a V. She slept over the last 3 nights, and each time she left something behind. A blouse, a pair of shoes, a toothbrush in the holder by the sink. His friends stare at him, pale fog still swirling through their eyes, and he knows that they care, knows they love him, knows they only want the best for him. They have to now, thanks to the deal. "Don't worry," he says, sipping his beer. "I'll take it slow." "Henry." He's half asleep when he feels her run a painted nail down his back. Weak gray light spills through the windows. He says, rolling over. Vanessa's got her head on one hand, blonde hair spilling down over the pillow, and he wonders how long she was leaning like that, waiting for him to wake up before she finally intervened. "I need to tell you something." She gazes at him, eyes frosted with that milky light. He is beginning to dread that shine, the pale smoke that follows him from face to face. "What is it?" he asks, rising onto one elbow. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I just..." She breaks into a smile. "I love you." And the scary thing is, she sounds like she means it. "You don't have to say it back. I know it's soon. I just wanted you to know." She nuzzles against him. "Are you sure?" he asks. "I mean, it's only been a week." "So what?" she says. "When you know, you know. And I know." Henry swallows, kisses her temple. "I'm going to take a shower." He stands under the hot water as long as he can, wondering what he's supposed to say to that, if and how he can convince Vanessa that it isn't love, it's just obsession. But of course, that isn't really true either. He made the deal. He made the terms. This is what he wanted. Isn't it? He cuts the water off, wraps the towel around his waist, and smells smoke. Not the scent of a match lighting a candle or something boiling over on the stove, but the char-black smell of things that aren't supposed to be on fire and are now burning. Henry surges out into the hall and sees Vanessa in the kitchen, standing at the counter, a box of matches in one hand and the cardboard box of Tabitha's things burning in the sink. "What are you doing?" he demands. "You're holding on to the past," she says, striking another match and tossing it into the box. "Like, literally holding on. You've had this box as long as we've been together." "I've only known you a week," he shouts, but she presses on. "And you deserve better. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to live in the present. This is a good thing. This is closure. This is—" He knocks the matches from her hand and pushes her aside, reaching for the tap. The water hits the box in a sizzle, sending up a plume of smoke as it douses the flames. "Vanessa," he says, gritting his teeth, "I need you to go." "Like, home?" "Like, go." "Henry," she says, touching his arm, "what did I do wrong?" And he could point to the smoldering remains in the kitchen sink, or the fact it's all going way too fast, or the fact that when she looks at him, she sees someone else entirely, but instead he just says, "It's not you, it's me." "No, it's not," she says, tears sliding down her face. "I need some space, okay?" "I'm sorry," she sobs, clinging to him. "I'm sorry. I love you." Her limbs are wrapped around his waist, head buried in his side, and for a second he thinks he might have to physically pry her off. "Vanessa, let go." He guides her away, and she looks devastated, ruined. She looks the way he felt the night he made the deal, and it breaks his heart at the thought that she will walk out feeling that lost, that alone. "I care about you," he says, gripping her shoulders. "I care about you, I do." She brightens just a little, a wilting plant fed water. "So you're not mad?" Of course he's mad. "No, I'm not mad." She buries her face in his front, and he strokes her hair. "You care about me." "I do." He untangles himself. "I'll call you. I promise." "You promise?" she echoes as he helps her gather her things. "I promise," he says as he leads her down the hall and out. The door shuts between them, and Henry sags back against it as the smoke alarm finally begins to ring. New York City, October 23rd, 2013. 13. Movie night! Robbie flings himself across Henry's sofa like a starfish, long limbs hanging off the back and sides. Bea rolls her eyes and shoves him over. "Make room." Henry plucks the bag from the microwave, bouncing it from hand to hand to avoid the steam. He dumps the popcorn into the bowl. "What's the movie?" he asks, rounding the corner. "The Shining." Henry groans. He's never been a fan of scary movies, but Robbie loves a reason to scream, treats the whole thing like another kind of performance, and it's his week to choose. "It's Halloween," defends Robbie. "It's the 23rd, says Henry, but Robbie treats holidays the way he treats birthdays, stretching them from days into weeks, and sometimes into seasons. "Costume roll call," says Bea. Dressing up, he thinks, is just like watching cartoons, something you enjoyed as a kid before it passes through the no-man's land of teen angst, the ironic age of early 20s. And then, somehow, miraculously, it crosses back into the realm of the genuine, the nostalgic, a place reserved for wonder. Robbie strikes a pose from the sofa. "Ziggy Stardust," he says, which makes sense. He spent the last several years working through Bowie's various incarnations. Last year, it was the Thin White Duke. Bea announces she's going as the Dread Pirate Roberts, pun intended, and Robbie reaches out and picks up a camera from Henry's coffee table, a vintage Nikon currently playing the part of paperweight. He cranes his head back and peers at Henry through the viewfinder upside down. "What about you?" Henry's always loved Halloween. Not the scary part, just the excuse to change, be someone else. Robbie says he should have just become an actor, that they get to play dress-up all year round, but the thought of living life on stage makes him queasy. He's been Freddie Mercury and the Mad Hatter, Tuxedo Mask, and the Joker. But right now, he already feels like somebody else. "I'm already in costume," he says, gesturing at his usual black jeans, his narrow shirt. "Can't you tell who I am?" "Peter Parker?" ventures B. "A bookseller? Harry Potter having a quarter-life crisis?" Henry laughs and shakes his head. B narrows her eyes. "You haven't picked anything yet, have you?" "No," he admits, "but I will." Robbie is still fiddling with the camera. He turns it around, purses his lips, and snaps a photo. The camera gives a hollow click. There's no film. B plucks it from his hands. "Why don't you take more photos?" she asks. "You're really good." Henry shrugs, unsure if she means it. "Maybe in another life," he says, handing each of them a beer. "You still could, you know," she says. "It's not too late." Maybe, but if he started now, would the photos stand on their own, judged good or bad on their own merits, or would each and every picture carry his wish forward? Would every person see the picture they wanted to see instead of the one he made? Would he ever trust them if they did? The movie starts, and Robbie insists on turning out all the lights, the three of them crammed together on the couch. They force Robbie to leave the bowl of popcorn on the table so he can't throw it at the first scary moment, so Henry doesn't have to pick up kernels after they're gone, and he spends the next hour averting his eyes every time the score whines in warning. When the boy rolls his tricycle down the hall, B mutters, "Nope, nope, nope," and Robbie sits forward, leaning into the scare, and Henry buries his face in his shoulder. The twin girls appear, hand in hand, and Robbie grabs Henry's leg. And when the moment passes, a lull in the fear, Robbie's hand is still resting on his thigh. And it's like a broken cup coming back together, the shattered edges lining up just right, which is, of course, wrong. Henry gets up, taking the empty popcorn bowl and heading for the kitchen. Robbie swings his leg up over the back of the sofa. "I'll help." "It's popcorn," Henry says over his shoulder as he rounds the corner. He tears the plastic wrapper off, shakes the pouch. "I'm pretty sure I just put the bag in the microwave and pressed the button." "You always let it go too long," says Robbie, right behind him. Henry tosses the pouch into the microwave and swings the door shut. He presses start, turns back toward the door. "So now you're the popcorn He doesn't get a chance to finish before Robbie's mouth is on his. Henry sucks in a breath, surprised by the sudden kiss, but Robbie doesn't break away. He presses him back into the counter, hips into hips, fingers sliding along his jaw as the kiss deepens. And this is better than all the other nights. This is better than the attention of 100 strangers. This is the difference between a hotel bed and home. Robbie is hard against him, and Henry's chest aches with want, and it would be so easy to fall back into this, to return to the familiar warmth of his kiss, his body, the simple comfort of something real. But that's the problem. It was real. They were real. But like everything in Henry's life, it ended, failed. He breaks the kiss as the first kernels begin to pop. "I've been waiting weeks to do that," whispers Robbie, his cheeks flushed, his eyes fever bright. But they're not clear. Fog winds through them, clouding the vivid blue. Henry lets out a shuddering breath, rubs his own eyes beneath his glasses. The popcorn rattles and pops, and Henry pulls Robbie into the hall, away from Bee and the horror movie score, and Robbie starts toward him again, thinking it's an invitation, but Henry puts his hand out, holding him back. "This is a mistake." "No, it's not," says Robbie. "I love you. I always have." And it sounds so honest, so real, Henry has to squeeze his eyes shut to focus. "Then why did you break up with me?" "What? I don't know. You were different. We weren't a fit." "How?" presses Henry. "You didn't know what you wanted. I wanted you. I wanted you to be happy." Robbie shakes his head. "It can't just be about the other person. You have to be someone too. You have to know who you are. Back then you didn't." He smiles. "But now you do." But that's just it. He doesn't. Henry has no idea who he is, and now neither does anyone else. He just feels lost. But this is the one road he won't take. He and Robbie were friends before they were more. Friends again for years after Robbie called it off, when Henry was still in love with him, and now it's reversed, and Robbie's going to have to find a way to move on, or at least find a way to smooth in love into love, the way Henry had done when it was him. "How long does it take to make popcorn?" shouts Bee. A singed smell wafts from the microwave, and Henry pushes Robbie into the kitchen, hits the stop button, pulls the bag out. But he's too late. The popcorn is irretrievably burned. New York City, November 14th, 2013. 14. Thank God Brooklyn has so many coffee shops. Henry hasn't been back in to roast. Not since the Great Fire of 2013, as Robbie calls the whole Vanessa incident, with a little too much glee. He gets to the front of the line and orders a latte from a very nice guy named Patrick, who is mercifully straight, who looks at him with cloudy eyes, but only seems to see a perfect customer, someone friendly and brief and... "Henry?" His stomach drops, because he knows that voice, high and sweet, knows the way it bends around his name, and it is that night again, and he is down on one knee like a fool, and she says no. "You're great, you really are, but you're not." He turns around, and there she is. Tabitha. Her hair has gotten a little longer, the bangs grown out into a sweep of blonde across her forehead, a curl against her cheek, and she stands with the easy grace of a dancer between poses. Henry hasn't seen her since that night, has managed, until now, to avoid her, to avoid this, and he wants to back away, to put as much distance between them as possible, but his legs refuse to move. She smiles at him, bright and warm. He remembers being in love with that smile, back when it felt like a victory every time he earned a glimpse. Now she simply hands it to him, brown eyes shrouded in fog. "I've missed you," she says. "I've missed you so much." "I've missed you too," he says, because it is the truth. 2 years of a life together, replaced by a life apart, and there will always be an empty space in the shape of her. "I had a box of your things," he says, "but there was a fire." "Oh, God." She touches his arm. "Are you okay? Was anyone hurt?" No. He shakes his head, thinking of Vanessa standing over the sink. "It was contained." Tabitha sways into him. "Oh, good." Up close, she smells like lilacs. It took a week for that scent to fade from his sheets, another for it to vanish from the sofa cushions, the shower towels. She leans into him, and it would be so easy to lean back, to give in to the same dangerous gravity that drew him to Robbie, the familiar pull of something loved and lost and then returned. But it isn't real. It isn't real. "Tabitha," he says, guiding her back. You ended things. No, she shakes her head. I wasn't ready to take the next step, but I never wanted it to end. I love you, Henry. And despite it all, he falters, because he believes her. Or at least he believes that she believes herself, and that is worse, because it still doesn't make it real. Can't we try again? She asks. Henry swallows and shakes his head. He wants to ask her what she sees, to understand the chasm between who he was and what she wanted, but he doesn't ask, because in the end, it doesn't matter. The fog twists across her vision, and he knows that whoever she sees, it isn't him. It never was. It never will be. So he lets her go. New York City, March 18th, 2014. 15. Henry and Addie offer up their rubber bands to the artifact, sacrificing one color at a time. For the purple band, they walk through puddles, inch-thick pools that ripple around their feet. Beneath the water, the ground is made of mirrors, shimmering, reflecting everyone and everything. Addie stares down at the ribbons of motion, the ripples fading, and if hers end a moment sooner than his, it is hard to say. For the yellow, they are guided into soundproof cubes the size of closets, ones that amplify the noise, and the others that seem to swallow every breath. It is a hall of mirrors, if the bending surfaces warped a voice instead of a reflection. The first message tells them to whisper, the words stenciled on the wall in small black type, and when Addie whispers, "I have a secret," the words bend and loop and wrap around them. The next tells them to shout, this stenciled word as large as the wall it's written on. Henry can't bring himself to go above a small, self-conscious holler, but Addie draws a breath and roars, the way you would beneath a bridge if a train was going by, and something in the fearless freedom of it gives him air, and suddenly he is emptying his lungs, the sound guttural and broken, as wild as a scream. And Addie doesn't shrink away. She simply raises her voice, and together they shout themselves breathless, they scream themselves hoarse, they leave the cubes feeling dizzy and light. His lungs will hurt tomorrow, and it will be worth it. By the time they stumble out, sound rushing back into their ears, the sun is going down, and the clouds are on fire, one of those strange spring nights that casts an orange light on everything. They walk over to the nearest rail and look out at the city, the light reflecting on the buildings, streaking sunset across steel, and Henry pulls her back against him, kisses the crook of her neck, smiling into her collar. He is sugar high and a little drunk and happier than he has ever been. Addie is better than any little pink umbrella. She is better than strong whiskey on a cold night, better than anything he's felt in ages. When Henry is with her, time speeds up and it doesn't scare him. When he is with Addie, he feels alive and it doesn't hurt. She leans back against him, as if he is the umbrella and she the one in need of shelter. And Henry holds his breath as if that will keep the sky aloft, as if that will keep the days from passing, as if that will keep it all from falling down. New York City, December 9th, 2013. 16. B always says returning to campus is like coming home. But it doesn't feel that way to Henry. Then again, he never felt at home, only a vague sense of dread, the eggshell-laden walk of someone constantly in danger of disappointing. And that's pretty much what he feels now, so maybe she's right after all. "Mr. Strauss," says the dean, reaching across the desk. "I'm so glad you could make it." They shake hands, and Henry lowers himself into the office chair. The same chair he sat in 3 years ago when Dean Melrose threatened to fail him if he didn't have the sense to leave. And now, you want to be enough. Sorry it took me so long, he says, but the dean waves away the apology. You're a busy man, I'm sure. Right, says Henry, shifting in his seat. His suit chafes. Too many months spent among mothballs in the back of the closet. He doesn't know what to do with his hands. So, he says awkwardly, you said there was a position open in the theology school, but you didn't say if it was adjunct or an aide. It's tenure. Henry stares at the salt and pepper man across the table and has to resist the urge to laugh in his face. A tenure track isn't just coveted, it's cutthroat. People spend years vying for those positions. And you thought of me. The moment I saw you in that cafe, says the dean with a fundraising smile. You want to be whatever they want. The dean sits forward in his chair. The question, Mr. Strauss, is simple. What do you want for yourself? The words echo through his head, a terrible, reverberating symmetry. It's the same question Melrose asked that autumn day when he called Henry into his office 3 years into his Ph.D. and told him it was over. On some level, Henry knew it was coming. He'd already transferred from the theological seminary into the broader religious studies program, focus sliding over and between themes that 100 people had already explored, unable to find new ground, unable to believe. What do you want for yourself? He'd asked, and Henry considered saying my parents' pride, but that didn't seem like a good answer, so he'd said the next truest thing, that he honestly wasn't sure. That he'd blinked, and somehow years had gone by, and everyone else had carved their trenches, paved their paths, and he was still standing in a field, uncertain where to dig. The dean had listened, and leaned his elbows on the table, and told him that he was good, but good wasn't enough. Which meant, of course, he wasn't enough. What do you want for yourself? The dean asks now. And Henry still doesn't have any other answer. I don't know. And this is the part where the dean shakes his head, where he realizes that Henry Strauss is still as lost as ever. Only he doesn't, of course. He smiles and says, That's okay. It's good to be open. But you do want to come back, don't you? Henry is silent. He sits with the question. He always liked learning. Loved it, really. If he could have spent his whole life sitting in a lecture hall, taking notes, could have drifted from department to department, haunting different studies, soaking up language and history and art, maybe he would have felt full, happy. That's how he spent the first 2 years. And those first 2 years he was happy. He had Bea and Robbie, and all he had to do was learn, build a foundation. It was the house, the one that he was supposed to build on top of that smooth surface. That was the problem. It was just so permanent. Choosing a class became choosing a discipline, and choosing a discipline became choosing a career, and choosing a career became choosing a life, and how was anyone supposed to do that when you only had one? But teaching might be a way to have what he wanted. Teaching is an extension of learning, a way to be a perpetual student. And yet, I'm not qualified, sir. You're an unconventional choice, the dean admits, but that doesn't mean you're the wrong one. Except in this case, that's exactly what it means. I don't have my doctorate. The frost spreads into a sheen of ice across the dean's vision. You have a fresh perspective. Aren't there requirements? There are, but there's a measure of latitude to account for different backgrounds. I don't believe in God. The words tumble out like stones, landing heavy on the desk between them. And Henry realizes, now that they're out, that they aren't entirely true. He doesn't know what he believes, hasn't for a long time, but it's hard to entirely discount the presence of a higher power when he recently sold his soul to a lower one. Henry realizes the room is still quiet. The dean looks at him for a long moment, and he thinks he's done it, he's broken through. But then Melrose leans forward and says in a measured tone, "I don't either." He sits back. "Mr. Strauss, we are an academic institution, not a church. Dissent is at the heart of dissemination." But that's the problem. No one will dissent. Henry looks at Dean Melrose and imagines seeing that same blind acceptance on the face of every faculty member, every teacher, every student, and feels ill. They'll look at him and see exactly what they want, who they want, and even if he comes across someone who wants to argue, who relishes conflict or debate, it won't be real. None of it will ever be real again. Across the table, the dean's eyes are a milky gray. "You can have anything you want, Mr. Strauss. Be anyone you want. And we'd like to have you here." He stands, holds out his hand. "Think about it." Henry says, "I will." And he does. He thinks about it on the way across campus and on the subway, every station carrying him farther away from that life, the one that was and the one that wasn't. Thinks about it as he unlocks the store, shrugs out of the ill-fitting coat and flings it onto the nearest shelf, undoes the tie at his throat. Thinks about it as he feeds the cat and unpacks the latest box of books, gripping them until his fingers ache. But at least they're solid. They're real, and he can feel the storm clouds forming in his head, so he goes into the back room, finds the bottle of Meredith's whiskey, a few fingers' worth left over from the day after his deal, and carries it back to the front of the store. It's not even noon, but Henry doesn't care. He pulls out the cork and fills a coffee cup as the customers filter in, waiting for someone to shoot him a dirty look, to shake their head in disapproval, or mutter something, or even leave. But they all just keep shopping, keep smiling, keep looking at Henry as if he can't do anything wrong. Finally, an off-duty cop comes in, and Henry doesn't even try to hide the bottle by the till. Instead, he looks straight at the man and takes a long drink from his cup, certain that he's breaking some law, either because of the open container or the public intoxication. But the cop only smiles and raises an imaginary glass. "Cheers," he says, eyes frosting over as he speaks. Take a drink every time you hear a lie. You're a great cook, they say as you burn toast. You're so funny. You've never told a joke. You're so handsome, ambitious, successful, strong. Are you drinking yet? You're so charming, clever, sexy. Drink. So confident, so shy, so mysterious, so open. You are impossible, a paradox, a collection at odds. You are everything to everyone, the son they never had, the friend they always wanted, a generous stranger, a successful son, a perfect gentleman, a perfect partner, a perfect drink. They love your body, your abs, your laugh, the way you smell, the sound of your voice. They want you, not you. They need you, not you. They love you, not you. You are whoever they want you to be. You are more than enough because you are not real. You are perfect because you don't exist. Not you. Never you. They look at you and see whatever they want, because they don't see you at all. New York City, December 31st, 2013. 17. The clock is ticking down, the last minutes of the year dropping away. Everyone says to live in the now, to savor the moment, but it's hard when the moment involves 100 people crammed into a rent-controlled apartment in Bed-Stuy that Robbie is sharing with 2 other actors. Henry is trapped in a hall corner where the coat rack meets a closet. He has a beer hanging from one hand and the other tangled in the shirt of the guy kissing him, a guy who's definitely out of Henry's league, or who would be if Henry still had one. He thinks the guy's name is Mark, but it was hard to hear over all the noise. It could be Max or Malcolm. Henry doesn't know. And he wants to say this is the first person he's kissed tonight, even the first guy, but the truth is, he isn't sure about that either. Isn't sure how many drinks he's had, or if the taste melting on his tongue right now is sugar or something else. Henry has been drinking too much, too fast, trying to wash away, and there are too many people in the castle. The castle, that's what they call Robbie's place, though Henry can't remember exactly when they christened it that, or why. He searches for Bea, hasn't seen her since he waded through the crowd into the kitchen an hour before, saw her perched on the counter playing bartender and holding court for a group of women, and... Suddenly, the guy is fumbling with Henry's belt. "Wait," he says, but the music is loud enough he has to shout, has to pull Malcolm's ear against his mouth, which Malcolm takes as a sign to keep kissing him. "Wait!" he shouts, pushing back. "Do you even want this?" Which is a stupid question, or at least the wrong one. The pale smoke swirls in the stranger's eyes. "Why wouldn't I?" he asks, sinking to his knees. But Henry catches his elbow. "Stop! Just stop!" He pulls him up. "What do you see in me?" A question he has come to ask of everyone, hoping to hear something like the truth. But the guy looks at him, eyes clouded with frost, and rattles off the words, "You're gorgeous, sexy, smart." "How do you know?" Henry shouts over the music. "What?" the other guy shouts back. "How do you know I'm smart? We barely spoke." But Malcolm only smiles a sloppy, heavy-lidded grin, his mouth red from kissing, and says, "I just know." And it's not enough anymore. It's not okay, and Henry's in the process of untangling himself when Robbie rounds the corner and sees Malcolm practically mounting Henry in the hall. Robbie looks at him as if he's flung a beer in his face. He turns and leaves, and Henry groans, and the guy grinding against him seems to think the sound is for him, and it's too hot in here for Henry to think, to breathe. The room is starting to spin, and Henry murmurs something about having to pee, but walks straight past the toilet and into Robbie's room, shutting the door behind him. He goes to the window, shoves up the glass, and is hit full in the face with a blast of icy cold. It bites at his skin as he climbs out onto the fire escape. He sucks in a breath of cold air, lets it burn his lungs, has to lean on the window to get it shut again, but the moment the glass comes down, the world hushes. It's not quiet. New York is never quiet, and New Year's has sent a current rippling through the city, but at least he can breathe, can think, can wash away the night, the year, in relative peace. He goes to take a swig of beer, but the bottle's empty. "Fuck," he mutters to no one but himself. He's freezing, his coat buried somewhere in the pile on Robbie's bed, but he can't bring himself to go back inside for a jacket or a drink. Can't bear the tide of turning heads, the smoke filling their eyes, doesn't want the weight of their attention. And he can see the irony in that, he really can. Right now, he'd give anything for one of Muriel's little pink umbrellas, but he's run out, so he sinks down onto the freezing metal steps, tells himself he's happy, tells himself that this is what he wanted. He sets the empty bottle beside a pot that used to be home to a plant. Right now, it holds only a small mountain of cigarette stubs. Sometimes Henry wishes he smoked, just for the excuse to get some air. He tried once or twice, but he couldn't get over the taste of tar, the stale smell it left on his clothes. He had this one aunt growing up who smoked until her nails went yellow and her skin cracked like old leather, until every cough sounded like she had loose change rattling in her chest. Every time he took a drag, he thought of her and felt ill, and he didn't know if it was the memory or the taste, only knew it wasn't worth it. There was pot, of course, but pot was something you were supposed to share with other people, not sneak away to smoke alone, and anyway, it always made him hungry and sad. Or really, sadder. It didn't iron out any of the wrinkles in his brain. After too many hits just made them into spirals, thoughts turning in and in and in on themselves forever. He has this vivid memory of getting stoned senior year, he and Bea and Robbie lying in a tangle of limbs on the Columbia Quad at 3 a.m, high as kites and staring up at the sky. And even though they had to squint to make out any stars, and it might have just been their eyes struggling for purchase on the black expanse, Bea and Robbie went on and on about how big it all was, how wonderful, how calm it made them feel to be so small. And Henry didn't say anything because he was too busy holding his breath to keep from screaming. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Bea is leaning out the window. She swings her leg over the sill and joins him out on the step, hissing when her leggings meet the cold metal. They sit in silence for a few moments. Henry stares out over the buildings. The clouds are low, the lights of Times Square shining up against them. "Robbie's in love with me," he says. "Robbie's always been in love with you," says Bea. "But that's the thing," he says, shaking his head. "He wasn't in love with who I was, not really. He was in love with who I could have been. He wanted me to change, and I didn't, and why should you change?" She looks at him, the frost swirling across her vision. "You're perfect just the way you are." Henry swallows. "And what is that?" he asks. "What am I?" He's been afraid to ask, afraid to know the meaning of the shine in her eyes, what she sees when she looks at him. Even now he wishes he could take it back, but Bea just smiles and says, "You're my best friend, Henry." His chest loosens just a little, because that's real. It's true. But then she keeps going. "You're sweet and sensitive and an amazing listener." And that last part makes his stomach drop, because Henry's never been a good listener. He's lost count of the number of fights they've gotten in because he wasn't paying attention. "You're always there when I need you?" she goes on, and his chest aches because he knows he hasn't been. And this isn't like all the other lies. This isn't washboard abs or a chiseled jaw or a deep voice. This isn't witty charm or the son you've always wanted or the brother you miss. This isn't any of the 1,000 things other people see when they look at him, things out of his control. "I wish you saw yourself the way I see you." What Bea sees is a good friend, and Henry has no excuse for not already being one. He puts his head in his hands, presses his palms against his eyes until he sees stars, and wonders if he can fix this, just this, if he can become the version of Henry that Bea sees, if it will make the frost in her eyes go away again, if she, at least, will see him clearly. "I'm sorry," he whispers into the space between his knees and chest. He feels her run her fingers through his hair. For what? And what is he supposed to say? Henry lets out a shuddering breath and looks up. "If you could have anything," he says, "what would you ask for?" "That depends," she says. "What's the cost?" "How do you know there's a cost?" "There's always a give and take." "Okay," says Henry. "If you sold your soul for one thing, what would it be?" Bea chews her lip. "Happiness." "What is that?" he asks. "I mean, is it just feeling happy for no reason? Or is it making other people happy? Is it being happy with your job or your life or—" Bea laughs. You always overthink things, Henry. She looks out over the fire escape. I don't know, I guess I just mean I'd want to be happy with myself, satisfied. What about you? He thinks of lying, doesn't. I think I'd want to be loved. Bea looks at him then, eyes swirling with frost, and even through the mist, she looks suddenly, immeasurably sad. You can't make people love you, Hen. If it's not a choice, it isn't real. Henry's mouth goes dry. She's right. Of course she's right. And he's an idiot, trapped in a world where nothing's real. Bea knocks her shoulder against his. Come back in, she says. Find someone to kiss before midnight. It's good luck. She rises, waiting, but Henry can't bring himself to stand. It's okay, he says. You go. And he knows it's the deal he's made, knows it's what she sees and not what he is, but he's still relieved when Bea sits back down and leans against him, a best friend staying with him in the dark. And soon the music dims and the voices rise, and Henry can hear the countdown at their back. 10, 9, 8, oh God. 7, 6, 5, what has he done? 4, 3, 2, it's going too fast. 1! The air fills with whistles and cheers and wishes, and Bea presses her lips against his, a moment of warmth against the cold. Just like that, the year is gone, the clocks reset, a 3 replaced by a 4, and Henry knows that he has made a terrible mistake. He has asked the wrong God for the wrong thing, and now he is enough because he is nothing. He is perfect because he isn't there. It's going to be a good year, says Bea. I can feel it. She sighs a plume of fog into the air between them. Fuck, it's freezing. She stands, rubbing her hands. Let's go in. You go ahead, he says. I'll be there soon. And she believes him, her steps clanking as she crosses the fire escape and slips back through the window, leaving it open for him to follow. Henry sits there, alone in the dark, until he cannot stand the cold. New York City. Winter 2014. 18. Henry gives up. Resigns himself to the prism of his deal, which he has come to think of as a curse. He tries to be a better friend, a better brother, a better son, tries to forget the meaning of the fog in people's eyes, tries to pretend that it is real, that he is real. And then, one day, he meets a girl. She walks into the store and steals a book, and when he catches her in the street and she turns to look at him, there is no frost, no film, no wall of ice, just clear brown eyes in a heart-shaped face, 7 freckles scattered across her cheeks like stars. And Henry thinks it must be a trick of the light, but she comes back the next day, and there it is again, the absence. Not just an absence either, but something in its place. A presence, a solid weight, the first steady pull he's felt in months, the strength of someone else's gravity, another orbit. And when the girl looks at him, she doesn't see perfect. She sees someone who cares too much, who feels too much, who is lost and hungry and wasting inside his curse. She sees the truth, and he doesn't know how or why, only knows that he doesn't want it to end. Because for the first time in months, in years, in his whole life perhaps, Henry doesn't feel cursed at all. For the first time, he feels seen. New York City, March 18th, 2014. 19. There is only one exhibit left. As the light thins, Henry and Addie hand over their blue rubber bands and step into a space composed only of plexiglass. The clear walls rise in rows. They remind him of the stacks in a library or at the store, but there are no books, only a sign mounted in the air overhead that reads, "You are the art." Bowls of neon paint sit out in every aisle, and sure enough, the walls are covered in markings, signatures and scribbles, handprints and patterns. Some run the length of the wall, and others are nested like secrets inside the larger marks. Addie dips a finger in green paint and brings it to the wall. She draws a spiral, a single expanding mark, but by the time she reaches the fourth loop, the first has already faded, dropping away like a pebble in deep water. Impossible. Erased. Her face doesn't falter, doesn't fall, but he can see the sadness before it drops as well, sinking out of sight. How do you hold on, he wants to ask. Instead, he dips his hand into the green paint, reaches past her, but he doesn't draw anything. Instead, he waits, hovering above the glass. "Put your hand over mine," he says, and she hesitates only a moment before pressing her palm to the back of his hand, ghosting her fingers over his own. "There," he says. "Now we can draw." She folds her hand over his, guides his index finger to the glass, and leaves a single mark, a line of green. He can feel the air lodge in her chest, can feel the sudden stiffness in her limbs as she waits for it to disappear. But it doesn't. It stays, staring back at them in that fearless shade. Something breaks inside her then. She makes a second mark, and a third, lets out a breathless laugh, and then, her hand on his and his on the glass, Addie begins to draw. For the first time in 300 years, she draws birds and trees, draws a garden, draws a workshop, draws a city, draws a pair of eyes. The images spill out of her and through him and onto the wall with a clumsy, frenzied need, and she is laughing, tears streaming down her cheeks, and he wants to wipe them away, but his hands are her hands, and she is drawing. And then she dips his finger in the paint and brings it to the pane of glass, and this time she writes in halting cursive, one letter at a time, her name. It sits, nested among the many drawings, Addie LaRue. 10 letters, 2 words. It is no different, he thinks, from the 100 other marks they've made, but it is. He knows it is. Her hand drops away from his, and she reaches out, runs her fingers through the letters, and for a moment the name is ruined, streaks of green against the glass, but by the time her fingers fall away, it is back, unmarred, unchanged. Something changes in her, then. It rolls over her, the way storms roll over him, but this is different. This is not dark, but dazzling, a sudden, piercing sharpness. And then she is pulling him away from the maze, away from the people stretched beneath the starless night, away from the carnival of art and the island, and he realizes she is not pulling him away at all, but toward something, toward the ferry, toward the subway, toward Brooklyn, toward home. The whole way, she holds tightly to Henry, their fingers intertwined, the green paint staining both their hands as they climb the stairs, as he opens the door, and then she lets go, surging past him, through the apartment. He finds her in the bedroom, pulling a blue notebook from the shelf, scrounging a pen from the table. She presses them both into his hands, and Henry sinks onto the edge of the bed, folds back the cover of the notebook, one of a dozen he's never used, and she kneels, breathless, beside him. "Do it again," she says, and he brings the ballpoint pen to the blank page and writes her name in tight but careful script, Addie LaRue. It doesn't dissolve, it doesn't fade, it sits there, alone in the center of the page. And Henry looks up at her, waiting for her to go on, to dictate what comes next. and she looks down past him at the words. Addie clears her throat. "This is how it starts," she says. And he begins to write.